The world is right now sleepwalking into the enormous dangers of nuclear war. The Biden administration, after just being rejected by US voters, is recklessly ramping up its armed confrontation with Russia. It's providing long-range missiles and internationally condemned landmines to Ukraine and allowing them to be used inside Russia. This is unimaginably dangerous. Even during the Cold War, the United States never provided weapons for use inside the borders of the Soviet Union. And Russian President Putin has been clearly saying that this crosses a red line, that Russia may retaliate with nuclear weapons, whether it's against Ukraine, Europe, or even the United States. This is a situation that could suddenly spiral out of control, but the response in the US media has been terrifyingly muted. Back when nuclear weapons were new, they generated an appropriate amount of awe and fear. Back in 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis held the country's attention for 13 days. The Soviet Union was planning to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, and they said it was to deter the US from invading Cuba, which they'd recently tried, and also the United States had weapons right on the border of the Soviet Union, and they wanted parity. As the Soviet ships approached, John F. Kennedy made an ultimatum, and for 13 days, the world knew they faced a terrible risk. Nuclear weapons then were new and still very much had the ability to shock, as objectively they should still shock us today. But today, while the New York Times reports on the alarming aggressions by Biden and the retaliatory threats from Putin, it buries this news far below the latest tabloid-style takes on Trump's cabinet picks. And when it does report on it, it can't help filtering it through its obsession with Russia baiting its domestic political enemy. As an example, in its news analysis on Friday, the Times Russia baits Trump implies that his stated desire for more friendly relations with Russia is because he's in Putin's pocket. This framing lets the Biden administration off the hook for its recklessness, and it dangerously propagates the ridiculous idea, now popular among US liberals, that advocating peace with Russia is equivalent to being a traitor. How do we find ourselves in this situation where we take nuclear weapons so lightly? It seems to me to be both a source of great strength and great weakness that we humans are excellent at normalizing situations. In a sudden crisis, this is a strength. If you've ever been in a terrible accident where you had to then help people who were in trouble, or if you've been through a grueling medical treatment for yourself or a loved one, but you still need to care for somebody or care for yourself, you might have felt this normalization at work. I know I did when my son had to go through a series of tough heart surgeries as a baby and a toddler. Things that sounded like terrible ordeals at first surprisingly quickly lost their sting as I started to live through them. And you could see why that's an advantage. I needed to think clearly to coordinate complicated medical care, to be present to my son, help him feel safe, and to organize the rest of my life so my other kids were cared for. But this tendency can lead us to underestimate the dangers that we face. And right now, we've entered the dangerous moment of history in which the United States and Russia maintain these enormous stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and that's become normalized. We act like we're not one miscalculation away from ending human civilization. The Biden administration is acting as if this horrible risk is worth prolonging an already lost war, a war in which they've repeatedly rejected peace negotiations because the sober analysts in DC want to gain points against Russia. This isn't a game. We've got to remember the warnings articulated so well by the last generation that was still capable of feeling shocked by the existence of nuclear weapons. The great Daniel Ellsberg died last year. And when he was young, he was a US security analyst, alarmed by the real possibility that the United States would use nukes in Vietnam. That's why he leaked the Pentagon Papers. And he spent the rest of his life, right until his death last year, warning us to dismantle what he called our doomsday machines. Noam Chomsky, too, has been a sober voice against nukes, but he's now in his 90s, and he's no longer healthy enough to speak publicly, sadly. Chomsky continually pointed us to the doomsday clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which currently stands at 90 seconds to midnight. That is, to a catastrophe capable of ending human civilization. That's the most dire the clock has been set to. It's much closer than the 7 minutes to midnight where it stood during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So while so much of our moral indignation is directed at Trump, for good reason, the so-called foreign policy experts in Washington are constantly reckless with our lives and even with the possibility of a future for humanity. The nuclear threat is real and we've got to take it seriously. The Biden administration should back off immediately and support a peace deal, which Putin has repeatedly said he would like, to end this festering war in the Ukraine that threatens us all.